people tend to over-optimize for salary and title early on, and they don't optimize enough for learning. So sometimes folks end up taking very high prestige or high salary positions, which aren't very high learning, and that kind of, stunts their career in the long run. I got one job that was paying me $55,000 a year, and I got another job that was paying me $45,000 a year. And I went to Hassan and I was like, this is a no-brainer. And he basically talked some sense into me, and he was like, no, this startup is growing fast. The amount that you're going to learn here, the amount that you're going to grow here is insane. So you should definitely take this opportunity and not worry about that extra $10,000 because you're going to make it over so many times over in your career. And he turned out to be completely correct about this. Welcome to the podcast. Well, we're called the Superhuman AI podcast, but over the last few weeks, we've been doing experimental topics just based on what, listeners have been writing in about. And frankly speaking, we're straying far from AI right now. I think this is our 4th episode now where we're not talking exclusively about AI, but we'll roll with the punches. Seems like folks are loving this. I'm getting lots of comments. I'm getting lots of emails from listeners like you who like this. So if you want us to keep this direction, if you want us to change this direction, it's Zain at superhuman.ai. That's Zain at superhuman.ai. Let me know what you think. And if you have a topic suggestion, we can roll with that next week as well. So today's episode is basically we're going to talk about specific ways in your career that you can build an unfair advantage. Hassan, what does the word unfair advantage even mean to you?
From my perspective, I think when I think about unfair advantage is that, hey, you're really exceptional at something very specific, or you have a combination of skills which allow you to deliver something really valuable, a great outcome. So obviously for everyone, it could be different what that outcome means. You're really good at fundraising money for companies from early stage to growth stage. Maybe you are the best deep sea diver or person if you want to go find hidden treasures in the bottom of the ocean. Or you are like one of the best cardiac surgeons. So if you have a heart issue, God forbid, that's the person you want to be doing your surgery. But in my head, you're really good at these things, and typically in the 0.1 to 1% of individuals in that category. That's how I kind of think about it. I don't know, then how would you, what about you?
Yeah, I think I agree with all those points. And what I'd add to that, I think it's any strength, number one, that gives you access to unfair opportunities or unfair income over time, right? So I think a good example is, Hassan, recently you and I had done some fundraising. Early on in our careers, fundraising used to be really difficult. Still difficult, but I think it's gotten considerably easier over time, and we can definitely go out there and raise more money than most folks, especially you. I think that's an example. So we'll talk a little bit about that specific one down the line. And I think the other one is, it's like the advantage has to be both valuable and hard to replicate. So, something like, a skill like typing really fast, for example, there's some value to that, but, just typing fast isn't that particularly valuable. Other people can learn it fairly quickly. And then it doesn't really give you access to any unfair opportunities, right? I think something else, like if you know how to code in a certain language better than anyone, I think AI is very big these days. If you, for example, know how to build an LLM ops pipeline or anything specific like that, then, you've got a very specific advantage there that's, hard to copy, very valuable, and gives you access to, high earning jobs and other opportunities that might be super valuable as well. Ready to supercharge your startup? Join the Google for Startups Cloud program and get up to $350,000 in credits. You'll also get expert guidance and access to cutting-edge AI tools when you join. Don't miss this opportunity. Apply now at cloud.google.com/startup/apply. Cool. So, I think now that we sort of have a broad idea what we're talking about, Hassan, I'll hand it over to you. Why don't you give me one specific tactic for how you've built your unfair advantage and how listeners can build there as well?
Yeah. So I think for me, what that has meant is taking risks early on in my career and saying yes to a lot of things. So what does that mean in reality? So during college or high school, I spent a lot of time, supporting student organizations or building new student organizations. When I saw there was an opportunity to build them, that got me into the entrepreneurship bug of hey, you can, if there's a problem, you go solve it, you can build something for that. There's no mechanism or someone stopping you to do that. In college, that translated into doing projects, which also started making money. And you started building skills around that. Hey, how do you promote a project? How do you sell something? How do you code something? How do you package it into a product which is useful? And that led to working at a very good startup in Silicon Valley, spending time there. And then from there, building my own startup, which ended up getting acquired, and then, on to the next thing. But I think there's a combination of being willing to say yes to things and taking risks early on. And a lot of people, I think, sometimes think about risks and say, holy shit, if I do this thing, it's going to be a very bad situation. But in reality, a lot of time the risk is being overestimated and the benefit and the outcome is being underestimated, right? So as an example, I think about a lot of my friends who work, consulting jobs or like accounting jobs, they say like, hey man, I would love to be an entrepreneur, but I just can't quit. And I would ask them like, hey, what's the worst situation that will happen? Let's say you quit, you go do this for a year and you fail. Most probably I will get the same job. Maybe I don't get the same title. Maybe I'll get like one title below that. So like in realistic sense, you either come back into your same exact job or you come back 2 years before that.
Yeah, I think when it comes to risk, I think about different kinds of risk. I think the most obvious risk for people is monetary, right? If I take this risk, I might have to forego 1 year's income, and that's the most obvious one. I think the two other types of risk that people are scared of is number one is time, like, will I lose time here? And then the final one, I think, is reputational risk. So, Hassan, for example, when both of us were graduating from college, everyone wanted to get into finance. Like tech was a thing, but it wasn't really a thing. Like if you were the smartest person on campus, or if you were one of the smart people on campus, you probably went into investment banking or private equity or something along those lines. Going into tech was still considered a bit of a risky move. So I think first thing there is, I think you need to consider, sometimes the risk isn't taking the low money move. Sometimes it's taking the low reputation move as well. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the second thing I will say is in terms of risk, there is such a thing as stupid risk and taking on too much risk. So when you're trying to differentiate risk in your mind, the first thing that you have to think about is what does the downside versus upside look here, right? In a good risk, the downside is limited, but the upside potentially is very high. So, we talked about the example of starting, joining a startup. Maybe you're starting your own company. Maybe you're taking on a new side project. Your downside there is maybe a few wasted months or, maybe, a few $1,000s forgone in salary or something. So limited downside, but if the situation succeeds, the upside potentially could be in the hundreds of thousands or even in the millions of dollars. So that's, asymmetric upside as people like to call it. But with other things, like, for example, taking on $1 million of debt to start a business when your business doesn't have any traction, when you don't have any customers, that may not be the wisest form of risk because, then you might have to go into complete bankruptcy and lose all of your assets and everything else. So it might not be the smartest risk. That's luckily why startup equity and fundraising exists. So in case you lose money on the startup or that goes to zero, you're not completely financially ruined. Those are sort of, I think two specific takes that I have around taking risks more smartly. The next one that I wanted to talk about, and again, this is about tied a little bit both to the reputational thing and to the money thing, is people tend to over optimize for salary and title early on, and they don't optimize enough for learning. So if you're early on in your career, honestly, even if you're not early on in your career and you're 10 years in, you should be optimizing for the learning over the salary and title when there is something valuable to be learned at that point. I think Gary Chan, who's the president of Y Combinator, has this thing where it's like, you should be earning or learning. And I think in the early, first 10, 15 years of your career, you should definitely be indexing heavier on the learning side. If you think about it, a title and a salary, are a function of a valuable skill set essentially. And a valuable skill set is just a function of what you've learned over time, right? So sometimes folks end up taking very high prestige or high salary positions, which aren't very high learning, and that kind of stunts their career in the long run. I think, by the way, most people don't realize this, but one of the reasons why big companies pay big is because they know that the learning and career acceleration that people are going to have at this company is going to be much slower, so they need to compensate for it in other ways. Now, a new grad or someone who's early on in their career might think, oh my God, I'm getting $10,000 more here, and instead of being an associate, I'm a senior associate. This is a great deal. No, they've designed this deal specifically because they know that you're not going to be learning here as much as other places, and you're going to have to wait years in line to get that promotion or get that raise or be in a meaningful position. So I think it's very important to do that. I think joining a startup isn't the only way to accelerate your position. I think, if you're working at a larger company as well, you can look at new initiatives. You can look at the most important parts of the company. I think those generally things that are a little bit younger within a company, those functions, those departments, those products tend to move a lot faster and provide a lot more learning versus something that's been at that company for a very long time. A very specific example here that I shared on the podcast last week as well is at one point in my career, I was job searching. Hassan and I were both housemates at this point. I got one job that was paying me $55,000 a year, and I got another job that was paying me $45,000 a year. Now, the $55,000 a year job honestly was a little bit of a dead job, wasn't going to lead to anything, but it's like $10,000 more. Where the other one was at a high growing startup, but they were offering me $10,000 less. And I went to Hassan and I was like, this is a no brainer. Like, hey, if this startup was a good opportunity, they'd be paying me. So since they're not paying me, I'm going to go with the higher earning thing. And he basically talked some sense into me and he was like, no, 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 this startup is growing fast. The amount that you're going to learn here, the amount that you're going to grow here is insane. So you should definitely take this opportunity and not worry about that extra $10,000 because you're going to make it over so many times over in your career. And he turned out to be completely correct about this. At the other company, the person who got that job instead of me 3 years later was pretty much, in the same job, to be honest. So, not a lot of career acceleration there. But when I joined the startup, it took me 3 years to go from almost like, entry level to then manager, director, and then leading the function as a VP. And, whatever that kind of gap in income was, that $10,000 made that over, many times over in a very short time as well. So, just because I prioritized learning at that point just led to, way more kind of, opportunity lower down in my career.
No, 100%. I think like the key thing is that in the long run, learning matters, right? Like if you're learning good stuff, you're delivering good outcomes, and you're on the positive trajectory, money is a byproduct of these two things. So if you're not learning, it's not going to work. And then like I remember the conversation as well, and I think I'm glad like you ended up taking that job because like a few years before that, like I was in a similar situation where I got an offer which was like 6 figures. And then I ended up taking a company offer, which was like almost 40K below that. And a lot of people thought that was like a very stupid move, to be honest. And I that's the reason I ended up building my first company, because I met my co-founders and it was most probably in hindsight the best decision. Obviously, like, sometimes it doesn't work out. And that's also, I think, important for people to know that it's not necessary that the decision you take is the right decision. And that's fine. Failure happens. But the key thing is that you need to make sure that you are picking your job, especially in your first 5 to 10 years of your career, for the right reasons. And the number one reason needs to be, hey, am I going to learn at an accelerated pace? And are the other people around me going to be supportive in my learning, in helping me build my network, helping me build my like industry persona, brand, all of those things? That's the most critical thing, which is going to pay dividends down the road massively, which at that moment in the short term may not seem like, but 10, 15 years, you'll be like, yeah, that's amazing. I'm glad I did like 3 years at like that company or something.
Yeah, 100%. Let's make this even more specific, right? Like, sure, you're at a smaller company, but how, like, why are you learning more at a smaller company or a smaller department within a bigger company? Or how can you actually learn, right?
No, I was just going to say, like, I think even like beside like what you mentioned earlier, like before you go into the smaller company, right? I think working in large organizations is also like a great thing, right? Like, hey, you go to McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, companies have like very amazing reputations. They pay you well as well, and they work you hard, right? Like it's a very specific skill set you will learn in 1 to 2 years spending there. And if you want to be good at, like, let's say, I want to be really good at financial modeling, it's most probably a great thing to go to Goldman Sachs. You get reputation, you get the best training, you get a great network, and then you can go do other things. So it's not necessary that you have to go to a small company. There are a lot of large companies where you can like learn very meaningful skills. But then the question is, how do you apply those skills, right? Like if you like, do you want to become like, like an MD at Goldman Sachs, a very different trajectory to like, becoming something else. So that's also the key question here.
Yeah, 100%. I think a little bit more that I'll add to that. It's, I think there's different signs of a company where you can learn more. I think the first one obviously is just talk to other employees at that company before you take that position. Ask them about their learning, ask them about their career growth, and sort of like a slightly sneaker way of doing this as well is talk to some folks who might have worked for your manager before, who might have moved on to other companies at this point, or former employees of that company, because they're more likely to be honest. You can usually reach do a quick LinkedIn search, find former employees at a company or within that department of the company, and just ask them what their experience was like. And if they say that was amazing, I learned so much, I grew so much in such a short period of time, that's a green light, or a green flag. But if someone says, hey, yeah, I was there for a couple of years, culture wasn't good, manager wasn't invested in me, didn't really get the support that I was looking for, I decided to just move on to this other company, then that's probably a sign that, that's not a great place to be learning. Another thing I'd say is, it's like, how much access do you have at this place to people who are smarter than you? So, the company that I joined, one of the reasons why Hassan pushed me to join, and I'm glad that I did in hindsight, is not only was I going to have weekly access to my VP, I was also going to get weekly 30-minute calls with my CEO, which I requested and they were happy to give me. And plus, I was sitting on the table next to the engineering and the product teams. And suddenly, I'd ask them about their work, and these people were way smarter in their domains than me because I didn't know anything about these domains. But, over lunch, they just sit down and teach me, what the fundamentals of these things are, or point me in the right direction. And that ended up being very, very valuable over the course of my career. Fuel your startup's growth with Google Cloud. Get up to $350,000 in free credits, expert guidance, and cutting-edge AI tools when you join. So join the 90% of GenAI unicorns that are using Google Cloud. But why choose Google Cloud? Because they offer personalized support, technical training, and a vibrant startup community. Ready to take your startup to the next level? Visit cloud.google.com/startup/apply to learn more and apply today.
You should also try to build skills which are rarely found together. So what I mean by that, Zain, here is that, let's say you are working at some finance institution and you're really good at data analysis. We just talked about like a large financial institution. So you're like really good at analyzing companies, looking at financial statements. That's an awesome skill. But now you combine that with storytelling. So now you can look at the data, analyze it, and tell a great story about a company. Insane. Now, let's add a third skill. You're really good at building relationships with individuals. So now you know how to analyze a company, tell a story around it, and you can build relationships with people who might be funders for this company or who may be looking to buy it. Because you're really good at relationship building, they're willing to listen to you. And you tell a good story, you have the data behind it, the story could be credible. The last thing is you're good at negotiations. So you're actually able to negotiate on behalf of this company to close a deal. So these four skills together suddenly make you a critical deal maker, right?
Yeah.
That's a very valuable skill. So that's where I think the exceptional unfair advantage comes, because a lot of folks, when they're thinking of selling their company, would call the person who's able to do all these things, then just hey, the data analysis, because they're hey, this person most probably will have a team who can do all these small segments in there.
Getting back to the point about combining different skills, I want to make a very important clarification at this point. There is a very big difference between combining a skill and being a generalist, right? I actually think being a generalist in most careers is not a good strategy, because in most careers, when a hiring manager or a CEO or anyone is hiring for a position, they're looking for a very particular skill set. What they're not looking for is someone to sit across from them and say that I'm sort of okay at these 5 different things. That's not a very compelling narrative, right? Combining skills isn't about being okay at 5 or 10 different things. It is about picking 2 or 3 things and being really, really good at that specific skill set, right? For me, that combination is not only am I really good at, marketing, I'm really good at writing and storytelling, which makes me really, kind of potent from a marketing perspective and building audiences and selling products and doing all those things. So that is sort of, my killer combination. There's tons of things that I'm not good at, and I would not consider myself, a generalist across many fields. So I think in most cases, I think it's an 80-20 thing. In 20% of careers, maybe being a generalist to some degree is important. I think very early stage startups, being a generalist probably is a strength because, you need to run around and do a bunch of things. But I would say in most companies, most careers, you really want to hone your skill set and be really potent at one thing or a combination of 2 to 3 different things. Hassan, I've never asked you about how you feel about generalist and generalism, but would love to get your take on that as well.
Yeah, I think the more I've been, I think just to be totally honest, when I was starting out in my career, I thought being a journalist was awesome. But more I've thought about it is that it's really about outcomes at the end of the day, right? So even if you're a journalist, at the end of the day, companies are hiring you for some outcomes, right? So it could be hey, you're the person who's going to be responsible for recruiting the best talent. Requires a lot of different skills, right? Hey, to recruit the best talent. If you are only good at, let's say, research, maybe you're not the best person for that. But as you go up in your career, there's an expectation that you're able to deliver outcomes,
Yeah.
right? Those outcomes require that early on you have tried different things and you have an understanding of some things, and then you've combined skill sets to deliver outcomes. Like you're really good at selling, you're really good at like promoting a product, you're really good at like hiring the best team, managing a team, operating a business. Like there's just specific, I think, outcomes people think about. And I think as folks think about being a journalist or a specialist early on, the key thing is that, hey, like what are the outcomes I want to get really good at? And those are the skills you should be focusing on. Then I think like one interesting point, which I think really applies well to you, and I think you're like really amazing at it, is that being a great advocate of your work, right? Like you obviously have built a massive following on Twitter and LinkedIn, leveraging your skills around writing, storytelling, research, and combining them all into one. And that has allowed, the type of work we do with Superhuman, type of work we do with like other products, like advocate for it. And I think a lot of people sometimes shy away from advocating about their work. Like, I don't know if you want to share something around that, because that I think is a very critical thing in unfair advantages.
Yeah, I think just to make it a little bit more crisper, it's basically, you have to be your own marketing channel. You have to be your number one kind of, cheerleader. And this is something that makes a lot of folks uncomfortable. And this is something, again, that comes with a little bit of a social cost. So for example, in school, if you talk about, hey, I just got an A plus, I did so well, you're a little bit of a show off and people don't really like that. But the reality, if you're in a company, is if you're doing great work, but no one knows about it, sure, you've done the work, but you are not able to realize the benefits or gains of that good work that you've done, right? If your manager doesn't know that you've done that good work, how could they possibly reward you for it, right? And the reality is your manager, everyone on your team, everyone in your company, they're just too busy to constantly obsess over you and see if you've done good work or not done good work, right? So the reality is it is your responsibility to communicate the good work that you've done across the company, right? And I see so many folks who are falling behind in their careers because they're like, hey, I did this amazing thing and no one at the company cares. And the first question I always ask them, does anyone at the company even know? And they're like, I mean, they should know. And I'm like, okay, but how should they know? And they're like, well, I did it, so they should know about it. And they're like, but you realize most people are obsessed with their careers, their jobs. They're not coming into the office being like, hey, I wonder what John or Jane did at work today or what they've done. No, that's not the case. Most people have no idea what you're working on in a company. So you need to blow your own horn. You need to be your number one kind of, cheerleader. You really need to put the word out there. Say, I did this project. Here's the outcome. Here's how it benefits our company, or here's how it benefits our customers, or here's how it benefits the rest of our team, right? I think that is the right way to communicate it, because that basically shows, it's not just about you. It's about how you've added value to other people and how you created that win-win, right? Like the right kind of, a promotion of your work clearly demonstrates the win-win for both sides. The bad kind of promotion is just promoting yourself without demonstrating how this is a win-win for both sides. Hassan, do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think like especially in large companies, this is super critical, right? Like because half the battle there is like it is a bit political to get promoted in like large companies, especially if you're mid and above, and half the battle just like people knowing what have you done, what is the impact, and it's so true, right? Like the other folks may just not have interacted with you, but they will be part of teams which are reviewing you for like the next promotion. And if you have just not been talking about the impact you are making, and there's like graceful ways to do that, right? Like graceful ways are you have like a larger hands-on, you present your project and the impacts it's making. Some people even like internally at companies have like a mailing list where they send like monthly updates about things they're working on, just so folks from other teams can stay updated on their work, which is a pretty nice way, but no one really tells you to do that. So it's like an interesting way to talk about your projects. But I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think very specifically in terms of ways to promote your work within a company, the most obvious opportunity is if you have a weekly one-on-one with your manager, if you have a weekly team meeting or a company-wide meeting, that is an excellent opportunity to talk about the work that you've done and the impact that it's had. That is the most obvious one. A few kind of interesting things that I've seen people do recently is I've heard some folks have launched internal company podcasts or internal company newsletters. They'll basically ask, different teams, or different people within their team, what is the most interesting or most important work that you've done this week? And they'll put that into a quick, kind of 200 word email or like a 15-minute podcast, and they'll distribute it to everyone in the company, right? So, I personally, as I'm running a company, Hassan is running a company, we definitely want to know what everyone on the team is working on. And honestly, it just makes our life easier if folks just tell us the work that they've done and what impact it's had, because it helps us understand what's going on, and it helps us understand that person's value to the team.
One thing I've been thinking about as we've been going through this conversation is that, right, like obviously we've talked about like few ways to build your unfair advantage, but I think there's some like fundamental skills or fundamental things people should just be doing, especially in the world we're going into, where like software is like really big, especially AI. We're getting a lot of agent-based tooling, which is growing and most probably will keep growing. In like, what are 3 to 5 things I think everyone should try to get good at? In your opinion, maybe it's not 3 to 5, maybe it's like 2 to 3. One thing in my head is that no matter like which career you want to get excellent at, I think you really need to just be good at selling. Like if you can't advocate for your work, as we talked about, no matter how good you are, most people will just not know, right? So you should just be good at advocating for your work, in essence. So that's, in my head, it's like being a good salesperson and telling stories.
Yeah, I think this definitely isn't a unique insight. Lots of people have said this before, but I think, the kind of 2 key skills are building something or selling something. Building something usually tends to be a technical skill. For example, you need to be, I run a newsletter, you need to be a really good writer. If you're in an app company, you need to be really good at coding. Then every organization is selling as well, right? So, regardless of what kind of organization you're working in, even if it's a nonprofit, you are trying to sell your product or your service to the organization. In a nonprofit, that service is you're helping society in some kind of way. You still need to communicate. You still, even as a nonprofit, you need to go out there and you need to collect donations. And if you're in the finance department or if you're a founder, then you might even need to be very good at fundraising. And again, that's a selling thing. Or hiring people. That's also a selling thing. When you hire someone smart, you need to sell them a story of why this is a good opportunity for them, and you need to communicate the value of them joining your team and your company over some other team or some other company.
I think like one way also to think about this is where I think it could even be more narrower is that the world we're going into, like AI, everyone needs to just be good at telling a story. And the best way to tell a story, which I think you do a great job at, is being able to write. And you have AI assistants to help you. But if you can't tell a good story, can't communicate that story, either verbally or in writing, I think it's going to become pretty challenging. No matter if you're an engineer, you're a doctor, you just need to be good at communication. And there are 2 forms of communication, is like verbal and being able to write well.
I thought maybe writing well was a skill that was very specific to what I was doing, because I was a content creator, I was a marketer, I was then, kind of creating a newsletter. So I was like, maybe this is very specific to me. But the more I look across every domain, the highest performers in most fields tend to be excellent writers as well. The most obvious example of this maybe is Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator. For folks who haven't heard of Y Combinator, it's the startup accelerator that's produced companies like Dropbox, Reddit, Airbnb, a few other big companies. And the way that he built it is he would write essays on his blog and he would publish them. And then this basically, all these essays became just legendary in Silicon Valley. And that helped him attract a lot of these founding companies to build a startup accelerator. And, now it's the biggest startup accelerator in the world, probably has done billions in revenue if I had to ballpark guess. But if you look at folks in other fields, right? So if you look at, I think of finance, I think of Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, these folks are legendary for the letters that they've written to their shareholders. Jeff Bezos, again, legendary for his shareholder letters, his team letters. And then, often when I go into Twitter, I'll notice that a lot of the big CEOs at other companies just happen to be excellent writers as well. And I think the question is, why is writing important, right? So I should get good at writing, but why? What does writing do for me? The reason why you should get good at writing is because it is the dominant mode of communication in the world that we're living in right now, right? So, if you're running a company or if you're part of a team, most of your communication is happening over text. You're sending emails, you're responding to Slack messages, you're writing like a pitch deck, you're writing the slides for your presentation. So a lot of the communication that happens within the company, I think most jobs, the majority of your time is spent outside of meetings. So the majority of the communication that's happening from your end is happening over text. Okay, writing is important. I explained why that's important. Cool. how do I become a better writer? Right? So I want to get a little bit specific on how do you become a better writer? I would say the first thing about good writing is that it is simple and easy to understand. In the real world, people just don't have time to sit down and read long messages and long ideas. And in most cases, 2 bullet points is more effective than 2 pages. That's number one, right? Number one, you need to be brief and you need to be concise. People don't have time for this stuff. The second thing is you need to use plain, simple language. In college, you use all kinds of like big fancy words. And, like at some point, in history, it used to be a flex, knowing big words in an industry used to be a flex. Honestly, it's like completely useless. Like the number of complicated words has absolutely no bearing on your success. Absolutely nil, in my opinion. I think the idea of someone, the height of communication is not explaining a simple or complex idea in complex words. It is explaining a simple or complex idea in simple words that anyone can understand, right? I think there's like this concept of Eli 5, like explain it to me like I'm 5. If you can explain your idea to someone like they're a 5-year-old, you've sort of, reached the height of being an effective communicator.
But I generally think that you got me into like writing on Twitter and LinkedIn. And I honestly found it really hard when I started out to like write my first tweet or even my first long LinkedIn post. Over time, it got better and better. And it really just was very helpful. And overall, I think even if you don't post regularly, just writing for yourself is very helpful. But it took me like 3 to 6 months. And after that, it got easier and it got better and better from there. But very happy that I got into it. And thank you, Zain, for that.
All right. So if you're interested in writing, I'll give you a couple of more bonus tips towards the end. But I just want to quickly recap everything we talked about in this podcast. So first off, we talked about, I have a list in front of me, so I'm just going to look off it and read. First of all was optimizing for learning over salary and title in the beginning. You want to take more risks, especially early on in your career, where you honestly just don't have that much to lose, and you want to focus on bets with asymmetric upside and ideally limited downside that doesn't completely ruin you. You want to build skills that are rarely found together. I think we talked about storytelling, relationship building, and any specific skill. You can always mix those in and build up a very compelling skill set. Next one, you want to promote your work shamelessly. In the real world, people are busy with their lives. They're not going to know whether you've done something or not. So you need to communicate the value of your work and do it in a nuanced fashion that communicates not only the work that you've done, but the impact that it's created for other folks. And then the final one, the one that we're talking about right now is become a better communicator. And the best way to become a better communicator today is to just become a better writer. We went over a few tips for how do you become a better writer, but the last 2 tips that I'll leave you with is number 1, write like you talk. And then the final tip that I have for you is the most important line in any piece of writing is the first line, right? Your first line is designed, number 1, to grab attention, and number 2, to convince the reader that this is something that they should be reading. Having a first line that grabs the attention and passes the what I call the so what test, right? Or why should I care test, is like the reader should be able to look at the first line and be like, okay, interesting. There's something in this for me, so I'm going to go ahead and read it.
I'll just add, Zain, like I honestly didn't really understand this value till I started writing on a regular basis, started using LinkedIn, Twitter, and just like writing in general. And it really made sense, right? Like your attention span is short. I feel like my sales skills have significantly improved, my memo writing skills, like all over my skills have just really benefited. So I totally agree with you. Like, this is such a critical point, what you just mentioned.
Yeah. Awesome. I think that's all we have for this week. Hassan, anything you'd like to add before you wrap things up?
I'm very excited to see like the feedback from the users.
Yeah, I mean, guys, we record this for you. So if you're listening to this, you got to let us know because, if you like this, we want to create more of this. And if you don't like this, we'll create something different for you. So yeah, let me know. Zain at superhuman.ai. That's Zain at superhuman.ai. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.